Title: They Found a Creature, but it shouldn't exist anymore. It began with a hole that wasn't there the day before. An ink-black circle where the jungle floor had sagged and given way, exhaling a breath of air that smelled like struck matches and something older. The storm that tore across the island that week had sheared cliffs and swollen rivers, but no one expected it to lift the Earth's lid on a chamber that had been sealed longer than anyone could guess. A farmer's goats found it first, skidding to a trembling stop when the ground cracked beneath them. By the time a local caving group arrived with ropes and headlamps, the sun was already bowing out. They peered into darkness that swallowed their light. From above, it looked like nothing. A sinkhole. Karst country does that. But when the first rope squealed over its edge and a climber dropped into the cool air, he described the strangest sensation, like descending into a different time. The temperature changed. The light died. The walls began to seethe with a pale living skin, lichens and fungi that hadn't seen stars. And at the bottom, a pool of water glinted coldly, flecked with oily rainbows that weren't oil, but minerals, rising from some secret channel far below. They called in a biologist from the provincial university, someone who spent her life chasing things that prefer the dark. She arrived with a small team and a battered field kit, curiosity humming behind her eyes. The air burned their noses with hydrogen sulfide. Their cotton shirts went slick with dew. They unspooled a line and took their first readings. The meter ticked and frowned. Low oxygen, high sulfur, salinity that didn't make sense this far inland. A signature, she said, of an ankyline system, a subterranean estuary that whispers to the sea through pores in the rock. Places like that collect strange things. They are quiet conservatories for life, with its volume turned way down. None of them expected bones. They lay in a pale crescent near the waterline, brittle and undecorated by moss. A jaw with needle teeth, vertebrae like beads, something with a flared plate that caught the light like porcelain. The biologist crouched, breath held. Later, when she would recount this moment, she would laugh softly and say she felt like an intruder in a chapel. It wasn't the age of the bones that chilled her. It was that they didn't look like anything she could name cleanly, slotting into one of the boxes the textbooks offer. They dipped a camera into that still water. On the screen, their faces hung ghostly as reflections until the lens adjusted, until it found a ceiling of rock overhead, and below, a tunnel breathing a slow current. White worms waved, a blind shrimp folded in on itself, ivory against the dark. Their light nudged a school of eyeless fish into a spasm, and they pinwheeled away, practiced in panic. Just for a heartbeat, something else moved. Not a fish, not anything that swam with fins. Something with jointed purpose slid across the field of view, hugging the wall like shadow-made flesh. It was a flicker, and they argued about it later. One said it was a trick of the silt, the camera shifting, the way nerves paint monsters where there are none. Another swore they saw segments, a rhythm of plates overlapping with patient, ancient logic. The biologist didn't declare anything aloud. She only played the loop until the battery died, face unreadable. Word leaked because word always leaks. A cousin told a friend who tagged a Facebook group for urban explorers. The thumbnail that traveled was a blur of cave wall and glare, but the caption was enough to light the match. They found something alive down there. The comments range widened like a fan. Someone posted a fossil trilobite. Someone laughed about Crocodile Dundee. Someone with a profile picture of a microscope cautioned everyone to relax. Renipedes, they wrote, are essentially living fossils. You'd think the Cambrian never ended if you only looked at caves. The biologist saw the post and agreed in the privacy behind her eyes. They'd been finding Lazarus animals for a century. Coelacanths didn't read their own obituaries. But this wasn't the Comoros. This was a shallow island sinkhole, a room with limited chairs. Renipedes don't get big. They don't do what the shadow did. They kept quiet. The team returned with better lights and a diver who had threaded the veins of caves on 3 continents. He tested his air, made jokes to push back the encroaching walls, and then slid into the black like a coin dropping into a well. The tether hummed. In the beam of his lamp, the world became a precise wedge, rough limestone, phantoms of bacteria curling away, the pale whisper of something dead and fossilized, then alive and hungry. He swam gently, the way you move when you know every touch is recorded. Every exhale changes the chemistry in a bottle you're trying not to tip. The tunnel narrowed, then ballooned. In the chamber beyond, the ceiling vaulted up like a cathedral abandoned to the sea. There were pillars. There were draperies of stone. There were tracks pressed into a smear of silt that no current could have made, and no fish could have etched. Staggered, repeated, the print of weight lifted and placed again. The diver filmed them, then something else claimed more of his mind. On the far side of the room, just above the meniscus, where water met air, strands hung like strings of pearls glued to the rock, the shed skins of something that molts in strips. They clung high, above a tide line that should not exist in a cave with no moon. He reached up, gloved fingers gentle, and teased one free. It came away feather-light, a lace of coltan that caught the light like amber held to the sun. Later, in a lab lit with the big bright lie of noon, they would lay it beneath a microscope and trace the articulations again and again. The pattern repeated the way language repeats, like someone was telling a story across epochs. Segments, ridges, sensory bristles that did not resemble those of any shrimp or amphipod catalogued. The closest analogs, the ones that made the room tilt, belonged to creatures known only in rock. What they had wasn't proof. It was gesture, a hint. They needed more. A man who reads the science journals reached out with a checkbook and an offer that didn't sound like funding so much as a purchase. He wanted an expedition. He wanted naming rights. He asked them not to tell anyone else until he could call a press conference in a city far from caves, far from the people whose goats grazed over the hole. The biologist said no. She talked to the cavers, who are not in love with money as much as they are with dark and with discovery. They agreed to move carefully. They'd publish if they had something to publish. Until then, they'd protect the site before the world arrived with nets and barrels and claims. Still, the world sniffed. A blogger with a good flashlight and a motorcycle helmet showed up at the edge of the jungle with a gimbal and big plans. He trespassed, as if that word applied outdoors. The team found him at dusk, grinning, legs dusty to the knees. He'd been near the hole, he said. He had felt cold air gush over his ankles. He'd heard something like a sigh from below. They asked him to leave. He winked and told them his video would be up by morning. It was. A patch of sky, a gasp, the edge of a rope, millions of views by sunrise, and the comments were a bonfire again. Meanwhile, the science continued, because it had to. They baited cameras with plumes of crushed shrimp and set them along the floor like candles. The design was simple, low light, long patience. The diver swam slow circuits and withdrew. The screens showed nothing but the pulse of distant copepods and the slow exhalations of rock. Near midnight, a current whispered through the chamber. The silt blurred, a shape ghosted in. Long, boneless, the way a whip is boneless. It didn't so much swim as pour itself along the perimeter, rippling arcs of muscle under pale armor. It paused at the bait, touched it with a pair of forward antennae, or were they palps? And then, very slowly, the body kinked into an S, and the head tilted toward the camera. There was no face there the way we prefer faces, but there was intelligence in the pause. Then, nothing. The screen went dark. They retrieved the device and found a gouge across its casing, a shallow kiss that had worried the memory card enough to corrupt its final seconds. They still had the approach, the turn, the moment where the creature made eye contact with the idea of them. That was enough to convince the cautious ones that this was not a misfiled shrimp. It was too large, too deliberate, there was no other word for it, anachronistic. When they finally sequenced the DNA from the sloughed chitin, most of it read like a language family whose cousin you met once at a wedding. There was crustacean in it. There was arthropod. There were flags on the tree that pointed to relatives you could hold in your palm. And then, a cluster of markers that threaded off into the underbrush of old phyla. The algorithms tried to anchor them and failed. The nearest stable branches belonged to lineages that, according to museums and the most current textbooks, had bowed out before any mammal called itself a primate. They didn't call the press. They called a second lab, and then a third. Replication is a spell with real power, and if the trick holds 3 times, the room begins to change. The second lab, out of habit, pruned away sequences that didn't fit. Noise, they called it. Artifacts. The third lab reran the sample with different primers and got the same impossible thorns. They did not scream. They did not throw their pipettes. They checked their math again, quietly, while the teachings of a century breathed down the back of their necks. The island's mayor came to the cave entrance with a flashlight and a look on his face like he was calculating the width of a new road. He talked of a park, of guided tours, of a gift shop carved into somebody's old tool shed. The biologist listened politely and didn't say that the breath of 36 strangers in that room would change the water's chemistry faster than a storm ever could. She asked for time. He gave them a week. By then, questions had outgrown their answers. What does it eat in a room with no sun? What hunts it? How many are there? How long has it been touching the same 4 walls, unobserved? Each question led to another, threading them deeper into the cave, into something like responsibility. The diver dreamed of the tracks at night, the smudged gate that spoke of legs, not fins. The blogger camped 3 ridges away, waiting for an angle. The money man watched his opportunity shrink and sharpened his contract's teeth. On the last night before the mayor's deadline, the team strung a final line across the cathedral chamber, a taut umbilical from which they hung their best camera, their last battery. It watched the molted skins and the bait and the place in the silt where the tracks began. They retreated to the surface, to the night air that tasted of rain. Their radios crackled, then flattened. The camera fed them darkness for 20 minutes, 50, 70. Then the frame tilted slightly, as if something had nudged the line from below. The silt rose in a curtain. Through it, 2 points of reflected light appeared at the very edge of the cone, the way compound eyes sometimes gleam when they catch a beam, multiplying a single shine into a field of cold stars. The screen washed out white in a sudden bloom. On the deck of equipment by the sinkhole, in the aching hours before dawn, no one spoke. They felt it then, without saying it. The moment just before the old world, the one whose edges they thought they knew, takes its first quiet step into a new shape. And everything that follows will be measured against the choice they make next.